Today we have an amazing guest. We have Allan Kehler joining us. Welcome, Allan. How are you?
Tracy, I am great. Thank you so much for having me.
I love the enthusiasm. I am so excited to have you on the show. What I want to do, I actually want to read your official bio because I think that really sets the stage to the conversation we're going to have today. And it shares a little bit more about who you are. So here we go. Allan is one of Canada's most sought after speakers when it comes to the topic of mental health. He has stood on more than 500 stages and is recognized for his dynamic and captivating approach. Allan reminds us that when it comes to mental health, silence has never been the answer. The time to talk is now. And I am so excited. That is exactly what we're doing. We are talking all things mental health. So I gave a little bit of a bio. Do you want to tell our audience more about you? And then we'll really just dive right in. I want to share, just so you guys know where we're going with this great conversation. Allan is a speaker and he's an author, and he has several really great books. I'll show you the one I have handy here. Mental Health, It's Time to Talk. So Allan's going to share his story and then talk about his books and his journey. So do you want to share a little bit more about who you are and what you do? And then we'll dive into your journey with mental health. How's that sound?
Off we go.
Excellent.
Tracy, the short and sweet is, I just spent so much of my life trying to harm or kill myself without really understanding the why. Like, I was just in so much pain, and I never really knew how to talk about my pain. And as you previously alluded to, silence is obviously not the answer. And I just come at this with such gratitude. Like, there is no logical reason why I should still be vertical and breathing after the life that I've led, other than all that I can come up with is I'm simply here to share some of my lived experiences, to carry a message. And so, yeah, very, very grateful to be in a position that I am.
I love it. And it's such a powerful thing that you're doing. To me, I was kind of forced into learning about mental health. I have never suffered from a mental illness. Of course, we all have mental health and a sliding scale, good to bad, but I've never dealt with mental illness. But as I got a little bit older, things just popped up in life. I had staff that had depression or this and that. And really, I was quite ignorant to mental health, and I was forced to learn. And just sharing a little bit of my journey, because I think it'll lead well into your story. Once I started to realize that people can't just suck it up and get over. It took me a long time to realize that, right? Because let's just muster it up, put on a motivational video and get going. Can't we all operate like that? Once I learned that not everybody is that fortunate, and had different situations, staff, different people I know suffer with different mental illness, I really dove in and learned. And to me, at this point of learning, I don't even understand why there's a stigma around it anymore. That's me. And when I talk about it, and when I bring guests on and do a mental health series on my show, let's just talk about it. We have physical health, we have mental health. There should be no stigma, and nobody should have to suffer in silence. It's just a thing, right? So I'm super sorry. That's a little bit long-winded because I've never actually shared why I do this and why I bring on guests like you guys, and why I kind of tend to do a focus every year. For the most part, our show is business, but I always do a mental health dive because I think it is so important. So can you share your journey? And I think so many in our audience will really appreciate hearing your story and your different journey. So long-winded intro, kind of sharing my experience. I'd love to hear your story now.
Well, first of all, Tracy, I do really appreciate the fact that you dove into the why it is a topic that's something that you are passionate about. I appreciate the transparency. And obviously, we are moving forward. Ideally, it would be great if stigma did not exist, but yes, clearly it still does. And I think for me, that's like you, why I'm so passionate about putting a face and voice to it. Because when I grew up, it was not like this. You know, I grew up in a town that had 4.5 road. That last half road was gravel. And it
Yeah.
was like living in a fishbowl. You know, everybody knows everybody. There's pros and cons to that.
Mm.
I had formed an identity that I excelled in athletics. I excelled in academics. Everything came easy to me. I was seen as the person who was president of the school, athlete of the year, captain of sports teams. I always smiled. And correct me if I'm wrong, but just because someone's smiling does not mean that they are happy. And so for me, the world was simply my stage. And when my challenges with mental illness started in grade 8, I did not know what to do with my thoughts. I knew that I was different. I could no longer look in a mirror. Later, I understood the why. You know, it was diagnosed as body dysmorphic disorder. What I saw was what other people did not see. And even I remember in grade 9 English, like we were just asked to write a poem. Write a poem. Okay. So I wrote this dark poem, and all my other peers are reading these poems in front of the class about their dog, about hockey. I get up there is no applause, there's just silence. And Tracy, it was at that moment where I realized I think I'm a little different. Okay. And the problem was this, because I didn't talk about my pain. Who suffered more than anyone else? Me. And I just continuously navigated through life smiling on the outside while I had all this pain on the inside. And then, I mean, I was a runner. I left home as soon as I was 16 for private school. Then I'm off to Holland. And I mean, I went nuts. I think in part when you don't have control, you want control. I grew up in a very rigid Mennonite community. Okay. And when I left that, I kind of went off the deep end, and my mental health started to really deteriorate, became an alcoholic, you know, a compulsive gambler. The short and sweet is this. Finally, I was able to meet with a general practitioner, a doctor, and I just kind of talked about where I was at. Now, I was forced into that by my mom, and that's often the case where it's a mother figure or a partner, someone who just pushes that person into help. That was how it was for me. It was so embarrassing. I felt judged. I felt like this professional did not see me for me. I was given a prescription and off I went. And then you fast track, and I spent the next 6 years being hammered with every kind of diagnosis. I met with so many psychiatrists. I was on a combination of 12 different pharmaceutical pills. I didn't know if I was coming or going. I had no identity. I didn't want to go within. And that was the whole problem. I think my very definition of addiction is it's a way to live outside of self so that we don't have to be with self. I never wanted to feel. And if somebody tried to make me talk about what was going on, I responded with anger. I was such an angry individual. And we see this often with men. But over time, I realized that beneath this anger is just pain. I was in so much pain, but I just didn't have that voice. And that just further caused me to isolate, withdraw. And then you get to a place where you often find out very quickly that if you want something different, you're going to have to do something different. And there were so many of those proverbial forks in the road for me. One of which was, I remember collapsing in a hallway outside of a classroom that I was teaching. I was actually teaching a special ed class in Edmonton at a junior high school. And to give you some context of where my life was at, a doctor had given me a month to live if I didn't change what I was doing. And honestly, I didn't really care. But I was just living a life fueled with alcohol, gambling. I was having seizures every day. And when I collapsed in the hall, I just remember these students peeking over and they're like, "Oh, Mr. K, are you all right?" Yes, yes, I'm fine. I smile. But I realized at that point, again, if I didn't do something different, I was not going to be around much longer. And there was something in me that really wanted to fight. And it was at that moment where I think I was able to start taking off some of that victim mentality, the V from my forehead. And I understood the value of putting a voice to my pain, of getting into support groups, and really learning that the act of feeling is what leads to healing.
Ooh, feeling. Yucky.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to feel. And yes. healing to your point, when you say yucky like that, I think sometimes we think of healing as this beautiful, nope. I mean, it's messy, it's ugly, but it's necessary if we want something different.
Well, geez, this is deep, but I mean, it can't be any deeper than your story here. And I'm like, ooh, I don't want to share. But, I think the pandemic, and to me, this is super timely. I just want to jump in there. For our audience, you were in Canada, you're in Saskatchewan still, right? Many farmers have had very tough year farming on the back of several tough years. Plus, we're dealing with the pandemic and all the stresses that brings. I think for the farming end and the farming audience, the mental health conversation is super important because that's stressful, right? You're like literally taking millions of dollars, throwing it in fields and hoping Mother Nature cooperates. But I think the pandemic is really bringing a lot of people's stuff up. And whatever level, whatever our stuff is, we have more time, I would imagine, less distractions because there's so much stuff we can't do. I think a lot of people's stuff is coming up because what do? You're stuck at home. You got to deal with it, right? So I think this conversation is more timely than ever. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Tracy. The code word still, but more pre-COVID, was always busy. You ask people how they're doing, busy, busy, busy. What I found happened more than anything else is as soon as the pandemic hit, to your point, it forced people to slow down. And all of a sudden, we couldn't have all these external distractions. And This is where I saw two things happen. Either number one, people embraced themselves. They started to strengthen the relationship that they had with them, with their kids, with their partner, or they went down a very different path where they got into perhaps self-injurious behaviors. We saw increases in alcohol use, domestic violence. And, I really feel for farmers because there are so many variables that are out of your control. And for me, the very definition of anxiety is trying to control the things that are out of your control.
Yeah. That's farming. It's farming, right?
Couldn't do it. Much respect.
Oh, yeah, I just do think this conversation is so relevant. And even myself, I'm, again, fortunate that I haven't had to deal with a mental illness, but I've gone from traveling all around, being gone often, to grounding to a halt in my home office. I'm not even driving anywhere. So all of a sudden it's brakes on. And I mean, we all have our stuff to go through, but it's like, wait a minute, challenging, right? Getting in, healing. Why do I have to be busy all the time? Wait a minute. Is it okay to just be quiet, slow down the pace, become a little healthier? So I can relate on my journey of the pandemic and the craziness that's going on. Okay, so that's your story. You ended up on the floor with students peering over you. Is that kind of what you would say is your rock bottom? And from there, the healing journey began? Is that a safe question?
That actually did not stop all of those destructive behaviors from taking place. The addictive lifestyle continued for probably 2 more years. The catalyst actually for change was this. I met my now wife, Tanya, and she had 2 boys. And I remember this, where they made me a cake, and it was so much more than a cake. it represented, I don't know, new beginnings, but here's what was different. These kids loved me for me. I had never really been around kids. And I remember thinking, what is this? Why don't I have to put on an act? Why don't I have to continue with like in addiction, we manipulate, we lie, we are not healthy. And these kids and my now wife, Tanya, that was the catalyst for change. I moved from Edmonton to Saskatoon 3 months sober. I moved in with her and her 2 kids with nothing to offer. You know, I had a lemon of a car, I had a couple boxes, I had no job, but she believed in me more than I believed in myself. And sometimes we need that. She told me that in this house, we are going to move forward. We're done with the self-harming behaviors. We are going to communicate what we need. This is going to be a loving home. And at that time, I was like, what is this? Like, this sounds really scary. It sounds terrifying, actually. But on the other hand, it sounds pretty beautiful. And so, you know, the rock bottom is such an interesting term, because for me, I think rock bottom is probably 6 feet under, because it can always get worse. I just know for me that I cannot go back down any of those slippery slopes. Like I'm at a place where I'm very much aware of what I can and cannot do. And I'm fortunate to have people around me who, you know, help me to lead a positive, healthy lifestyle. I've had to cut ties with a lot of unhealthy people.
Yeah. That I'm sitting here listening to that. I'm like, I'm going to cry. I very rarely cry on my own show. I think this would almost be the second time, but I'm like, oh, she sounds amazing. Your wife sounds lovely. That's a great story.
Thank you. I'm blessed. I'm very blessed.
I don't know if I read that in your book or online or in a video, but I did hear that. I'm like, wow, his wife just sounds amazing. What a woman. You're lucky. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So that's your story. We chatted a little bit about healing. I don't know if you want to chat about that a little bit more. I want to chat. What's the most challenging part of your mental health journey? There's so many places we could take this conversation.
Well, when I struggled with my mental health and addictions, it was just me. I was bringing myself down. And that's very different than when you have a wife and when you have children under the same roof, because it is very hard when, and I mean, I'm not nearly at the place where I used to be. Like, suicide's off the table. I will not go there. And that feels really good. Like, as a side note, I lost my best friend to suicide. And that was a catalyst where I just saw too much and I understood that I cannot do that. But the challenge is now when I struggle, I see the ripple effects that it has on the people who I value the most. And while I'm so grateful, there's still a part of me, I guess, that finds it, it's hard, you know. On the other hand, I've learned the value of communicating. And Tanya, for example, you know, she can see those signs in me before I even feel them. And then we can talk, we have the supports in place. But the short and sweet, the challenge is, the effects.
Yeah. You know, and why I wanted to go here, and I think you're the perfect guest for this. As I mentioned, it's been a tough couple of years and literally a terrible year this year for farmers. And I mentioned this in a previous episode, but there's been beef farmers that have had to sell their whole herd, producers that are getting 10% of their crop off, right? Like, that's damaging the bank account, the ego, all of those things. And I heard of at least 2 that I know, I mean, distant, not in this area, farmers that are on suicide watch. And mental health is a big issue in agriculture. The anxiety that comes with making a living in this industry, right? The stress. So this conversation, it's so deep, it's almost scary to have, but I think it's important. There's people in our industry that are hurting, right?
100% it's important. And I think that words like suicide are so emotionally charged, but I tell you, wow. So tomorrow will actually mark 10 years from Justin's passing when he died by suicide. And so I've kind of been sitting with that and reflecting. What I know is this. I think that we often fear asking the question because we fear the response. I think that we often don't know what to do when a loved one is struggling. We can see that they're in pain, but we don't know how to approach it. Elders always remind us that there's a reason that we have two ears and one mouth. And I think that what I've learned is that when I'm in pain, I don't need to be fixed. I think for me, and maybe for you too, Tracy, it's like I just wanted to be seen. I wanted to be heard, and then ultimately supported in my own way, which is different for everyone. But where I'm going with this is I think that what we can offer people is just the check-in, something like, I don't mean to pry, but I'm concerned. And I just want to let you know that if you ever needed to talk, I'll be here. And the key thing is that then when they do go to that place of vulnerability, that we just listen. And it's significant because emotions are energy. Darkness cannot survive in light. What a gift. If we can give people the space to be free from some of that emotional pain, it's remarkable what will happen. That's why people always say, oh, I feel so much better. But the barrier, whether it's for farmers, egg producers, is to be vulnerable. And as men, that is something that does not come with ease because of the perception of being weak or how they will then be perceived. But if we can just get to that place of taking a risk, the rewards are numerous. And understanding too that this is not how it's always going to be. That's the problem, especially in the context of mental health. Like I got in my head, and being alone was a scary thing because then I'm stuck with this, and this was not healthy. So I had to start letting people in if I wanted a chance at breaking that cycle.
Oh, this is so good, Allan. To be vulnerable, because I don't love that either. I say I'm like a man. I don't like the whole talking and the vulnerable as much as I think most women do. But I bring amazing guests like you on because you know what? I didn't know anything about mental health, and I'm still learning. And especially in the times that we live in, not to repeat, but I think it's important that we understand this. There's just a lot of people struggling. Honestly, I wouldn't, suicide, that word does scare me. What would I do if somebody mentioned that to me? How do you broach that? I guess I'm having these hard and uncomfortable conversations on camera with great guests like you to help people in our audience. If they're out in a farming community and they're worried about their husband, their wife, neighbor Bob, what do? Right? Where were we taught this stuff? Right?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to come to the general conclusion that silence is not the answer, meaning not talking about it will not work when we're trying to progress towards the solution. Justin, for example, when Justin died, his parents were farmers, Ed and Janet.
Okay.
What I loved about their approach is they made a conscious decision right away not to be silent. They said that this has been a death by suicide. And that for them must have been very, very difficult. And I've talked to Ed about this a few times. But what was very neat is in this small rural community, people rallied around them. They supported them. And here's the beautiful thing, Tracy, when we give ourselves permission to be vulnerable, the ripple effect just goes on, and it gives other people permission to have those conversations. And just like that, you hear the two most powerful words, me too. Because how many families, how many different people have experienced suicide to some degree, but don't want to talk about it. When you have these conversations, it gives other people permission to go there. And while they're hard, they are necessary, because pre-COVID, I think I was on like 12 different reserves in a span of 3 months where there had been suicides. And here's what I found. I found that a lot of times, mostly the men would just have that flat affect, no emotion after these losses. And one of my students invited me to her reserve. Her daughter was 10 when she died by suicide. 10.
Oh.
And so I'm entering into these situations and I'm watching. And so often the flat affect is there, and the kids are always like, okay, you know, they look up to us as adults. And if we as adults cannot shed a tear, if we can't reach out for help or be vulnerable, why the hell would they? Yeah. And that has been my greatest source of motivation to talk about all of this, because the next generation is always watching. And I do not want my kids, we have 4 boys, I don't want them to have to go through some of that internal pain, internal turmoil like I did.
Yeah. My goal, and I mean, I've recently started chatting about this. To me, mental health should be talked about equally to our physical health. And I'm sure one day our health system will be there where you go to your doctor and they say, how are you doing physical, right? Let's do a physical. Okay, how are you doing mentally? Are you happy? And whatever tests they would do, whatever questions they would ask you. And if you had concerns, you could talk about it with your doctor. Shouldn't that be the way it is? We're not there yet, but I think one day it will be, with how much great work that you guys are doing and helping to remove the stigma, right? And you're right. If kids, exactly. I can imagine that, being a little kid and going, oh my gosh, this is sad. Somebody died. Oh, mom and dad don't seem to be very upset. And they seem a little weird. So maybe I can't talk about it either, right? And then they probably internalize that, and whatever happens. Interesting. Wow. Okay. I had to take a minute there. This is a tough and great conversation. I'm so happy to have you. I know I'm going to say that a few times. I would like to shift gears a little bit. We talked about your journey and healing, some of the hardest parts, what you've experienced. And I want to share a quote from the foreword of your book. And it's Michael how do you say his name? Landsberg?
Yeah, Landsberg.
Yeah, okay. I've heard him speak as well. I think he was at an event, but he said, Allan Kehler is using his pain to relieve the pain of others. And I love that. Totally. That is just bang on. So I would like for you to share why you decided to speak out. Like that moment, there must have been a moment or a series of moments. You went through your experience, your healing, and then you go, oh, I should talk about this. Oh, right? What was that? How did that start?
Who knew? Who knew? I wish in hindsight that I could have known. That sure would have helped me get through some of those dark nights, knowing that someday I could use my pain in this manner. But that also speaks to, you never know. And I have an incredible twisted sense of gratitude that I had to go through everything from mental illness, addictions, sexual abuse, suicide, all these things. But it's allowed me to get to where I was. And I guess the whole catalyst for starting to put my face and voice to something was when I was a compulsive gambler and I started to go to these support groups. There were never young men who attended, ever.
Really?
And so I thought to myself, there has to be others who are struggling, because the shame was so intense. Alcohol, it's seen as a legitimate addiction. Gambling, not so much. So I actually rented a church basement and started my own support group for other men. And Global News in Edmonton actually picked it up. And that was the first time I'd ever been interviewed. And I realized what can be done through a message. And I contacted the Problem Gambling Resource Network in Edmonton. It was the only place I could find that had a resource. And I walked into those doors and I said, can I please meet with the executive director? and he happened to be there. His name was Ray Reschke. I shook his hand and I said, my name is Allan Kehler. Let me be a face and a voice to these issues. And he started to pay me $75 to go to schools, jails, treatment centers. And that's what I did for 2 years. I was beyond terrified. But what happened is, as soon as I started to talk, well, I felt better. And more importantly, other people start to say, like we already talked about, me too. And then I thought, why would I not? And I just accepted that sometimes we have to do things afraid.
I love it. I was curious about your journey and when you decided to speak up. Now, here's a question. Well, you kind of answered it. Were you scared of being judged or ridiculed or for other people to find out?
Initially, 100%. Yeah. It's pretty cool that I've arrived at a place where I'm so beyond that, but that took a long time. I've been with the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers for maybe 8 years. And I remember early on, a mentor told me, the moment that you get up on that stage, before you even open your mouth, there will be people who have a problem with you, no matter what you say. They may not like the way that you look, how you dress, your mannerisms may remind them of someone that they know. You cannot internalize the thoughts and judgments of others. Live for you. And that, I think, has helped me immensely because we will never appease the masses. It's not possible. And so for me, I think I've been able to push that aside and just, it's been very, very hard to be my authentic self. But and of course, there's so much work to be done, but I feel comfortable in my skin. And I honestly never thought that would happen. Never.
Lovely. That is a great story. That's a great journey.
Thanks.
Okay. I would like, I just feel like we could talk for hours about this stuff. This is good. You've shared some stuff that I didn't even know where you would go with this. So that's been great. Thank you. Do you want to share anything more about your experience, your past, what you've learned? Because the two last things I want to get you to leave our audience with is some information on your books. I want you to talk about your books, why you wrote them, who you wrote them for, and then we're going to round off the episode with words of wisdom. So before we transition into books and words of wisdom, is there anything else you want to add at this point?
I think I'll just maybe segue into the book because I think that this is profound. I think it's important. My fear was always that I would initially be ridiculed, judged, be perceived as lesser than when I reached out for help. When I interviewed all of those men for that last book, I just found it very interesting that every single person had the similar fear. But when they were finally able to be vulnerable and reach out for help, they all said the exact same thing, which is the same thing that I said. Wow, I feel better. I feel better. No longer do I have to hide behind that proverbial mask. I feel free. I feel liberated because, like we already said, emotions are energy. And it was that first step. Every single person feared judgment. And what was so beautiful was that the outcome, it was opposite. Like all of them were met with compassion and, dare I say, love, where, they always had the clenched fists, afraid, and then they realized that there was just so many outstretched fingers waiting for them. And I guess I can look back, and it was a choice for me to isolate and withdraw. There were so many people who would have been there, from family, friends, but I pushed them all away through addictions. And, it was essential for me to come to that understanding that what I thought was going to happen did not happen. And that played out through so many different people. What I'm saying is we are our greatest barrier.
Amen. Isn't that the truth in everything?
Yeah.
I love that. And that is profound, just so you know.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, you have a few books. I have this one and I've read through, haven't finished it all. I'm working my way through the stories, and there are very impactful stories in here. This is an amazing book. You have one or two other books, right? Can you talk about your books in the order, who they were written for, a quick snippet of what a reader would get, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure, Tracy. The first book, I've written 4, and the first book was actually on addictions, because I started to work at an addictions treatment center, and I just found that so many people were ill-equipped to deal with it. The individual who's struggling, but also family members. How do you help someone when you have front row seats to this horrific show? And so that book just kind of helped navigate people through the challenging world of addictions, touched on suicide, self-harm. Then I did a book on, it's called Born Resilient, because I really was fascinated by what is it that allows people to fight. And so I interviewed a lot of different people and used their stories, because I don't think anything connects us like stories. And ironically, a year ago, we launched a clothing line called Born Resilient, because that word resilient is everything for me. And then there's a very short and sweet book, Goodbye Stress, Hello Life, which is just tools for wellness. And this last one, this is what's interesting for me. Shame has dominated my life, and I've always struggled with value. I have never been proud of a book that I've written. The truth is, even when I do these in-person events, and this happened right before COVID, there's like 100 people in line. They're waiting for me to sign their books. And I'm saying in my head, what the hell is wrong with you? Why would you buy this? Like, this is shit. You know, it's like it's like I still fight those. And where I'm going with this is that last book was the first time that I felt some pride. Like, I felt like, okay, this book can really help. And I'm not a religious person. I'm very spiritual. And the reality is this: those books were written by me, but they weren't. I am simply like this catalyst where it's like information just comes through me and I write. That book there, I had no intention of writing it. Tracy, this sounds ridiculous, but it, like, something actually hit me on the head when I was shoveling the driveway in the front, and the whole book just went poof, and I threw my shovel in the snowbank. I ran inside and I grabbed my laptop and I just typed out the whole skeleton. And that night, or maybe it was the next night, one of the two, I had like it wasn't even a dream. It was a vision. I'm not a vision kind of guy. There was like this long line of people, and they all had a piece of paper, and they're handing me this piece of paper. I'm like, what is it? What is going on? What? Oh, this is their story. Oh, what? These are all men. And I realized, oh, this is supposed to be a book written by men for men. And that, like, from, I don't know, start to finish, 10 months, it was so much bigger than me. It always has been.
That's amazing. You know, and it doesn't sound weird, Allan, because I would say I'm spiritual too, and whole nother podcast for us to talk about. But sometimes I do believe we're destined to do certain things and go through certain things. And that might be the body of work that we're meant to create. I do believe there is some fate in life. So that's interesting that you say that. And, you know, I love that so much of this conversation about mental health is really geared towards women, I find, but a lot to men. And forgive me if I get a little stereotypical here, but I think women, for the most part, from the beginning of time, have understood the healing power of talking, chatting. Women, our group of women, right? And chatting it up. Women always get together and talk about their problems. And I know personally, when I've chatted with my girlfriends, you chat about something that's bothering you in life, right? And you have a good girl chat. And then when you're done, you go, oh, it's just gone, right? Like that worry or stress is gone. And I think women have enjoyed that. Very stereotypical. So nobody emailed me with hate mail here. Speaking from my experience, women know the power of chat, but I think you're very right. There's that stigma about men talking, right? And getting men to realize it's okay to talk. To me, I find if you keep your emotions inside, this is Tracy's very doctor synopsis of mental health. If you keep your emotions inside, it's going to be a volcano and it's going to overflow. Small level, right? If you keep it inside, that's not healthy. It just builds up, right? So I love that you have really geared this towards men, because men need to hear these things and see the examples and the stories and the great men in this book that suffer and have talked about it and found healing in that, right?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. But you know what's interesting, Tracy? When we wrote that book, we already knew that it was going to be mostly women who bought it, which isn't that sad? But that's that. And to this day, even when I'm doing in-person events, or it's still 80, 90% women who buy it. But at least we're moving.
You know, I think that makes sense though, too. I've heard a lot of the advisors flipping to the business end of our show. These advisors that work with farm families that have problems, whether it's farm conflict or succession planning or financial advice, it's usually the woman that grabs the information, learns, and spearheads it. I think that's a thing. And here, even though the woman might be buying the book, she's reading and she's passing it on, right?
Right.
I would probably say that's what's happening. Not that it's not getting to who it's meant to, but maybe they need the ladies to kind of slide it where it needs to go. That would be my guess.
I totally agree. And a book is a safe way to do that. It's like, hey, here's some stories in your own way, in your own time. Feel free to dive in. And then, you kind of back off.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I wanted to have you on the show, because this is an amazing, powerful message. Thank you. And your work is amazing. Amazing, Allan. If you haven't heard it a million times, just so you know, it's amazing. And to me, in my life, in different areas, learning, business, psychology, self-help, books have changed my life. And I especially want to bring guests on like you with books, because you know what? There's going to be somebody in our audience that's going, my husband or my wife has a drinking problem. They're numbing. And whatever the case is, they're going to be listening and they're going to go, oh my gosh, I'm going to order that book, right? Or that's going to sit there until they need it. Because sometimes I call the books the breadcrumbs in life. You grab the book, you read it, and it's like, oh, that idea. And then they can act on it from there, right? So to me, books have changed my life. And to have strong books on mental health, to me, that's a game changer. So thank you for writing them. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. I'm going to get you to leave some words of wisdom. Come on, Allan. Well, no pressure.
First of all, I think that here's what I find beautiful. In that book, there is a man named Matt Kelly who also lives in Saskatchewan. He's a farmer, seed grower. And I love the metaphor that he paints, because I've seen this time and time again in Saskatchewan. I'm sure that you and your listeners have as well, where if there is some kind of a family crisis, like if somebody, say, gets cancer and they can no longer get through harvest, what happens? You have all these farmers who unite, who get together and get it done. They come together. And I do see this happening. And that's what Matt says too. Like he's seeing more and more farming communities start to put a face and a voice to this and starting to, like I said, unite. And it's a beautiful thing. It is very scary, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that risk leads to reward. And I mean, I moved 12 times in 6 years. And well, first of all, I learned you cannot run from self. Did you know that? And the constant was this. There was it's like a 4x6 picture. And I hung that picture on every single wall, every place that I lived. And it said this: however long the night, the dawn will break. And it was a picture of a sunrise. That was gifted to me from my parents. And that was my anchor. That, like, hope is everything. So for any listener who is at that place where it's dark, and they're struggling, it's that understanding. It's very cliche, but that this too shall pass. This will not be forever. And hope and that resilient spirit is everything. If you can understand that you truly have survived 100% of your most challenging days, if you can buy into that, that will serve you well.
That's amazing. I love those words. This too shall pass. Even when I go through hard times, I say that, right? This too shall pass.
Yeah.
Those are amazing words, Allan. I really appreciate it. And you know what? Thank you for having the courage to start sharing. That's amazing. And writing these books and speaking on stages, joining us on shows. You have changed lives, are changing lives. So thank you very much.